Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I'm not sure where everybody is in the world, and welcome to the Fletcher School for this important event focused on recent research and the current situation in Tigray. For those of you not so familiar with the Fletcher School, for almost 90 years, we have been at the forefront of understanding international affairs, the relationships between states, actors and peoples. And in much of those 90 years and from our founding, we have sought to understand how international affairs can be pursued in order to keep on building a world where everyone can experience justice and where we can see greater and deeper peace. We have, through many of those years, pursued scholarship and understanding the dynamics of war and the dynamics of conflict. And in particular, in recent years, many of our scholars have pushed back the boundaries of understanding new dimensions of conflict, including those related to the systematic use of sexual violence and putting boundaries or understanding around how famine should not be used as a tool of war, but how it often can be. Much of that scholarship has led to evolutions in the way that the international system looks at these issues, and we're proud of our engagement and pushing back the boundaries of understanding in these critical areas. Which brings me to today's event, and I am so glad to see such a widespread group of people from all over the world with us today. I just want to put this in its context. So the armed conflict and the humanitarian emergency in Tigray, Ethiopia, is a matter of urgent concern, and obviously some controversy with different people from different parts of the world, different people within Ethiopia and across the Horn of Africa holding different views. It's precisely, therefore, this kind of event which makes the Fletcher School so special. It is a complex emergency. It is undoubtedly a human tragedy. It has political implications and economic reverberations across Ethiopia, across the Horn of Africa, across the wider African region, and across the world. These are the kinds of issues that we should be familiar with, interrogate, and we should be able to look at from all different perspectives. I personally was shocked last week by the testimony of the United Nations Relief Coordinator to the Security Council, Mark Lowcock, and was also called to action as a woman who's held high office at the United Nations by the words of Pramila Patten, who is the Special Rapporteur for sexual violence. I, together with a number of leading women around the world, are looking at how we can bring our voices together to see whether or not the international community can do more to bring about a cessation of hostilities, but also then to understand what is going on, this human tragedy, and try to bring it to an end while broader conversations take place around the need for a lasting peace. Since the outbreak of the war in November, Alex de Waal, who is a professor at the Fletcher School and executive director of the World Peace Foundation, and we're very pleased to be able to host the World Peace Foundation, has been quite outspoken and prolific in drawing attention to the crisis. In fact, long before many people were paying attention, certainly before I was paying attention. He has drawn attention to the need for humanitarian access, for the investigation of crimes committed by the belligerents, and the need for a political settlement. His position has drawn the ire of many people and the praise of others. So he has held a position which has in and of itself become controversial. As the Dean, I've been pleased to field numerous inquiries about his views and the views of the Fletcher School, and I've been pleased to defend his academic freedom and the academic freedom of all those at the Fletcher School to pursue scholarship, to follow the evidence, and to speak out when that evidence moves them to a view. We also adhere to principles of rigor in the research that we conduct. And before anything is published by our faculty or our students, we expect the highest standards. 2 weeks ago, the World Peace Foundation published a report entitled Starving Tigray, How Armed Conflict and Mass Atrocities Have Destroyed an Ethiopian Region's Economy, Food System, and Are Threatening Famine. That report is the subject of our discussions today, and I offer it to you, for those who haven't read it yet, as a thorough piece of work. I hope that today's event sheds light on how we have reached such a dire situation and can be food for thought as we hope that the international community steps in and that the belligerents will move swiftly to stop the human tragedy and to move into a mode of conversation, discussion, dialogue, so that this region can recover. So with that, I hand over to those who have put in so much hard work and understanding and who know this country and region much better than I. But I am pleased to welcome you to what I hope will be a thoroughly significant and somber event, but one which hopefully will lead to a greater awareness, and that greater awareness will lead to urgent action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Kite, and thank you to you and to the Fletcher School for providing an environment in which we can exercise our academic freedom and pursue our mandate as World Peace Foundation to seek peace, justice, and the alleviation of human suffering. Greetings to everybody, and to those of you who are from Tigray, my condolences, because all of you, I know, will have lost somebody whom you cherish, and those of you who have not lost someone in your close family will have, I am sadly, dismally confident, have lost somebody you know. Tigray is an exceptionally serious human rights crisis and humanitarian crisis. And it's a crisis about which the world knows far too little. But we do know enough. And this event is concerned with what we know, how we know it, what it means, and what can be done about it. Now, the internet in Tigray has been shut off. The cell phone coverage for most of the region has also been shut off. There are virtually no reporters who are able to report from the region, apart from the capital, Mekelle. And many of those are, especially the Ethiopians, are systematically intimidated. Aid workers are able to travel to only a handful of major towns. And sadly, it is getting worse. It is getting more restricted by the week. Now, normally when information is suppressed in such a widespread blanket manner, it means there's something going on the authorities don't want us to know about. And that's a fair assumption in the case of Tigray. But for our purposes today, let's not make that assumption. Let's give a benefit of the doubt to the government of Ethiopia. And let us subject all our analysis, all our evidence to the most rigorous standards. And in our report, Starving Tigray, we do that. We would like to have had much, much more information than we do. What we have is what we have, and you can see it there. There is publicly available open source material, and some of the research assistants will be referring to that. It's all fully referenced. It's all accessible. It can all be checked. There's a handful of first-hand testimonies. Those individuals, obviously, for obvious reasons, don't want their names used, but we know who they are, and that can also be checked. And there are established models for food security, food systems, and livelihoods from which we can extrapolate, from which we can draw valid conclusions. This gives us a solid basis. Now, as Dean Kite said, I have been outspoken. I've drawn a lot of criticism. And I take succor from the fact that every independent person who has been in Tigray privately tells me that what we are saying is correct, and indeed that the realities are more dire, they are more severe. And that there are, every day I hear about things that cannot be fully proven. Many of them then become known facts later on. It is indeed getting worse. The UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock, in his remarks to the UN Security Council last week, indicated just how dire things were. The current planning figure for those in need has risen since we completed our report from 4.5 million to 5.2 million. We have, for example, reports that Eritrean troops are systematically stealing food assistance after it has been distributed. We have not yet been able to confirm exact times and places. We have not published that. So some of the issues that we will cover in the next hour or so are as follows. The first question, is it famine? We don't say that it is. We are cautious. But there is no question that the humanitarian crisis is heading in that direction. There are starvation crimes being committed. What are they? We document numerous cases of the destruction, removal, rendering useless of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. We document numerous cases of pillage. These are overwhelmingly by the organized forces under the command of the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments. And it does look awfully systematic. There are not only these starvation crimes, there are the dismantling of an economy, reducing a population to long-term destitution and dependency. And some of the issues in that we will touch upon in the next few minutes. And lastly, an issue to which we will return is there's a clear link between crimes of sexual violence and starvation. Rape is a crime. Systematic and widespread rape may be a crime against humanity. And rape in this context may also be a starvation crime. So to explore this, we have a panel of four from starting with Hadush Gebremedin, who is a student at Tufts from Tigray, who will highlight some of the issues that he sees as most important. Then we will turn to three research assistants at the World Peace Foundation who have worked on this report, Chris Newton, Chris Brew, and Delia Burns. And then I will turn to our own Professor Tom Dannenbaum, Professor of International Law at Fletcher, for his reflections on how justice for starvation crimes might be accomplished. Now, we have the Q&A open. We will not be having, as it were, live questions, but please put your questions in the Q&A and I will moderate the discussion and I will field those questions. So let me first ask Hadush to put on his video and to tell us in just a few minutes what he sees as the most pressing and important issues from his perspective as a member of the Tufts community who is from Tigray. Hadush.
Yep, thank you.
Please go ahead, Hadush. We can't see you, but even if you're having a technical problem with the video, we can hear you.
Thank you, Alex. So my focus will be like, since the war broke out in early November 2002, a systematic starvation is going on for the Tigrayan people. When we look into the agriculture sector, particularly, which 8% of the population in Tigray relies on as the main economic sector, due to the war, all of the farmers were not able to harvest their crops. And with the war being started, the Amhara militias from the west and the Eritrean troops which are coming from the north, just along all throughout Tigray, they were burning the crops on the field as well as from the storage where it had been harvested. Besides to that, the Eritrean farmers and the Eritrean troops and the Amhara militias were burning the crops all, and they were also executing the farmers, arresting them, and most of the farmers also left behind everything for safety reasons. Besides, the Eritrean troops the militaries went house to house. They were killing farmers, young men, which are supposed to be active in the agriculture sector. And they were raping the women and girls basically what they found in each house. Looting houses and farm equipments were common across the region, and livestock and motor pumps and generators and small farm machineries has been looted by the Eritrean and the Amhara militias. When we see to the livestock, for example, in Western Tigray, about 2.56 million herd of cattle has been stolen from the farmers, as the farmers were flooding out from that area due to safety reasons to Sudan and to Aksum and Shire and to other parts of Tigray. So it's close 700 households has been displaced from Western Tigray alone. And obviously ethnic cleansing is going on in that particular area. And crops which are permanent crops like orange, mango, and papaya, all in central Tigray and western Tigray, has been purposely and systematically cut in order not to produce any further food for the farmers. On the other hand, humanitarian aid to rural farmers were highly restricted or either looted by the Eritrean troops and the Amhara militias where it was heading to support the rural community. No humanitarian aid were reached to ethnic minorities, which are the two ethnic minor communities in Tigray, the Europe and the Kunama people, which they have never received any humanitarian aid until today. In short, Tigrayan farmers are systematically and forcefully separated from their farmland and farming equipment and the agricultural inputs. That is, the land and the machineries and the students are not really available, and the farmer is not yet there to produce agricultural crops by next season. This is a systematic starvation and pushing to long-term famine and humanitarian crisis to the Tigrayan people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hadush. And I think implicit in what you just said is the importance of those farmers being able to prepare their land and plant their crops in the coming few weeks before the rains start. Because should they fail to do so, this crisis will undoubtedly be prolonged for at least another 12 months. So thank you, Hadush, and I'm sure we will come back to you in the questions. Let me now turn to the three research assistants who proved in a remarkable way, actually, over the last few weeks, what it is possible to do at a distance in terms of doing this type of rigorous research using the available public source information. So I'm going to ask Chris Newton first, and the slides, and he's going to show us a few slides, and then we will go seamlessly on through the three of them. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. So I'm going to start us off with just a few key points in terms of our framing of the paper before my colleagues go into much greater detail about starvation crimes in conflict in Tigray. So here we're looking at the food security situation of Ethiopia as of October 2020, as given by the Famine Early Warning Systems Network. We see Tigray in the north of the country, that light green color signifying little to no food insecurity at the time as of October 2020, and pretty consistently, again from FuseNet reporting, Tigray has been shown to be one of the most food secure areas of Ethiopia in the last 5 years. Next slide, please. Now we jump ahead to the period February to May 2021, and we see that very clear deterioration in food security status of Tigray, that red area in the heart of the region, the most food insecure in all of Ethiopia. And broadly speaking, we would generally expect people or a population faced with the conditions consistent with that red shading to see a pretty sharp rise in the rate of mortality. Next slide, please. And we emphasize in the paper that famine, not just as a time-bound event, but as a process, can have pretty different time lags or a timeline from shocks to the onset of famine. For example, historically, we might expect famine to occur after one or more failed livelihood cycles. For example, in agriculture, a cycle from planting to harvesting and back again, due to shocks like drought. But in a situation where starvation is being used as a weapon of war, we have numerous examples, unfortunately, of this timeline being dramatically shortened. Starvation crimes can substantially accelerate a process of famine. Next slide, please. And when we start to look at Tigray in terms of its livelihood systems, its economy, long-term structural shifts, we see a sort of paradox of resilience in that as a result of changes in Tigrayan livelihoods over the long term, we've seen a substantial increase in resilience in the region to some shocks like drought, but an increase in vulnerability to other shocks, specifically armed conflict. And we spend a lot of time looking at the example of seasonal labor migration. So some of the most densely populated areas of Tigray are also some of the most dependent in terms of their annual income and access to food on seasonal labor migration, these dark green areas on the map here. Next slide, please. And within Tigray, one of the top destinations or receiving industries of that seasonal labor migration is sesame production, predominantly for export. And this is a relatively recent shift in terms of Tigrayan livelihoods historically, with sesame production really taking off only after the year 2000. Next slide, please. In terms of Ethiopian exports, which for products in 2019 were a little over $3 billion, other oily seeds, which is overwhelmingly sesame, was around 11% of that, at 347 million, just under 30% in Tigray, just under 50% in Amhara region neighboring. In Tigray alone, the sesame industry was providing up to, on a very rough estimate, around 200,000, some of the highest paying seasonal labor opportunities in the country, predominantly for the poorest households from the more densely populated areas in eastern Tigray. Next slide, please. This map just kind of emphasizing those light green areas in northwestern Ethiopia. Again, the very high returns in terms of how labor is turned into purchasing power, particularly for grain on this map. And this is exactly what is being attacked, being dismantled, and being inhibited through starvation crimes in Tigray right now. That sesame producing zone is where we see evidence for ethnic cleansing. The push for the annexation of land from Tigray to Amhara region is overwhelmingly these sesame producing areas, with the destination areas of the seasonal labor migration. But we also see the cumulative impact of violence and other acts within starvation crimes on the freedom of movement for the civilian population, even if those seasonal labor opportunities still existed out in Western Tigray, much of the civilian population would have no means of accessing them as things currently stand. But my colleagues will go into much greater detail on starvation crimes themselves.
Thank you, Chris. I think your presentation points to the way in which an accumulated expertise about how these systems work is intrinsic to understanding what is going on. Let me pass on to Chris Brew.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor DeWall, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So to document evidence of starvation crimes and other mass atrocities in Tigray throughout our report, our team has utilized a variety of methods, including satellite imagery, fire tracking imagery, such as NASA's Fire Information for Resource Management, social media data gathering and analysis, and a couple of key witness interviews as well. Through this documentation, a pattern has emerged that often starts with clashes between coalition and Tigrayan forces, followed by massacres of civilians, the looting and destruction of property, ostensibly as punishment for supporting opposition militias. Next slide, please. So different looting strategies have also emerged during our research amongst the varying armed actors. Ethiopian federal forces have primarily concentrated on looting banks, government offices, and microfinance institutions, almost all of which belong to or are operated by the Tigrayan regional government. On the other hand, Eritrean forces have focused on privately held commercial or personal possessions, such as household goods, grain stores, cars, and larger equipment such as generators, trucks, and tractors, all the way down to small items, or items as small as the boxes carried by shoeshine boys, which contained candies and socks. Similar methods have been employed by the Amharan militias occupying Western Tigray, who have looted everything from crop harvest to generators, water pumps, and medical equipment. Next slide, please. At all levels, directly or indirectly, this looting and destruction has deliberately targeted food supplies and objects indispensable to survival, such as those grain storage and crop storage facilities, livestock, and farming equipment. And objects that have not been easily looted have been destroyed or rendered useless, which is indicative of a wider strategy of starvation instead of just personal or command enrichment. Next slide, please. In addition to private assets, the Eritrean and Ethiopian forces have also engaged in a campaign of looting and destruction of Tigrayan government-owned enterprise and industries. Factories owned by the Endowment Fund for the Rehabilitation of Tigray, known as EFFORT, employed 47,000 workers and their families prior to the outbreak of conflict. The Almeida textile factory in Adwa, which is pictured here on this slide and is owned by EFFORT, provides a good example of the strategy of these coalition forces, where soldiers first dismantled all the sewing machines and equipment that they could easily carry and loot, and then bombed and destroyed the rest of the heavy machinery, rendering it useless. Destruction of water and sanitation offices and facilities have severely limited access to potable water throughout Tigray. And a February UNICEF mission to Shire discovered that no access to drinking water for more than 170,000 residents and 52,000 internally displaced persons, many of whom had been drinking from nearby rivers. Medical facilities have also been deliberately targeted for pillage and destruction. Teams from MSF visited 106 medical facilities, finding only 13% functional, with nearly 70% looted and 30% damaged. Individual accounts report that as of mid-March, Eritrean soldiers were still using the Mulugat Health Facility in East Tigray as a base for operations, and Abiy Adi Hospital remained occupied by Ethiopian forces, preventing up to 500,000 people from accessing health services there. The effects of little to no healthcare provision on civilians have been severe. Partners on the ground have witnessed an increase in mothers dying at childbirth as their deliveries continue to go unaccompanied by skilled birth attendants. I will pass it over to my colleague Delia to discuss more.
Thank you so much, Chris. Sexual violence, ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, immobility, and the denial of humanitarian access are all acts that can both enable and constitute starvation crimes. Rape has been used as a tool of terror, oppression, collective humiliation, and ethnic cleansing against Tigrayans. As of the end of last week, at least 800 have sought medical care for rape in 5 hospitals in Tigray. This is indicative of there being thousands more survivors. Men have been made to abuse their family members while their children watch. Women have been gang raped and forced into sexual slavery, some for weeks on end. In a closed briefing last week, the head of UN OCHA shared one agency's report that 30% of attacks on civilians have involved some form of sexual violence. The reality is that these survivors of sexual violence are less able to obtain the essentials for life and to support their families, especially in providing care for children. This also operates in the other direction. We have already seen this with women being forced to exchange sex for food. With regard to forced displacement, the UN expects that more than 1.7 million Tigrayans have been displaced, including the 140,000 that were forcibly removed during the ethnic cleansing campaign in Western Tigray. When displaced, individuals are separated from their livelihoods. Farmers cannot till their land, and vendors cannot man their shops. Moreover, people are unable to move to the places that they want. Workers are unable to move to their places of work. As my colleague highlighted earlier, we are likely to see that the upcoming planting and harvest seasons suffer from limited labor migration. Next slide. And humanitarians are struggling to respond. The humanitarian response prior to the outbreak of conflict has been severely undermined. Over the past few months, armed forces shelled and burned Hitsats and Shemelba refugee camps, displacing more than 100,000 Eritrean refugees into the bush. Many went without food for 2 to 3 months before the camps were even destroyed. The remaining 2 refugee camps are far above capacity. Next slide, please. Furthermore, humanitarians are struggling to coordinate a response amid the information blackout caused by the shutdown of internet and mobile network services by the federal government. As Professor DeWall mentioned earlier, 4.5 million people have gone without consistent phone, internet, or electricity since November. Not only are aid workers struggling, but the survivors of the conflict are unable to call their loved ones for help. Crackdowns on journalists and other media staff are increasingly common. The recent attacks on journalists go against progress made by Ethiopia in recent years to increase press freedoms, one of the current government's key promises. In one example, a Tigrayan journalist and his friend were shot in their car while traveling outside Mekelle in January. Just last week, 2 more journalists were detained on charges of spreading misinformation about the atrocities committed in Tigray. Regarding the physical access of humanitarians to the region, Agencies are still highly limited by the unpredictable security situation. True humanitarian access allows aid workers to enter the area, conduct aid activities, and exit safely. Aside from the aid workers themselves, civilians in need should be able to access assistance and return home safely. For the first 2 months of the conflict, humanitarians were entirely cut off from the region. Now, despite improvements in national approvals, only 1.7 of 4.5 million, well now 5.2 million people in need have been reached. These 1.7 million are mainly those residing on or off the main highways, which themselves are inconsistently passable. The situation in rural areas remains entirely unknown, but is likely to be quite grave. Even when aid reaches the areas of needs, many items have been reportedly destroyed or looted by armed forces. Other reports tell of civilians having to exchange sexual favors or give up the identities of their male family members for food items. Back to you.
Thank you, Delia. It is really a distressing situation. And I think that link that you highlighted between crimes of sexual violence and starvation crimes is something that is perhaps a new insight that that we are being presented with, and it may be an issue that we can bring up in the discussion. But let me turn to Professor Dannenbaum to respond with a lawyer's perspective on what he has been hearing and learning.
Thank you, Alex. So when you think about international criminal accountability in this context, there are really two questions to be answered. First, which courts? And second, which crimes? When we think about the first question, it's really a jurisdictional question. Aside from ordinary domestic criminal accountability in the courts of Ethiopia or Eritrea, there are three main alternatives. The first would be accountability before the Permanent International Criminal Court in The Hague. The second would be the creation of an ad hoc internationalized tribunal for this specific situation. The third would be accountability before foreign domestic courts exercising universal jurisdiction. International Criminal Court jurisdiction attaches ordinarily to crimes perpetrated by the nationals of or on the territory of a state party under Article 12.2 of the Rome Statute. Neither Ethiopia nor Eritrea is party to the ICC statute, so that leaves one of two alternative, rarer and more politically contingent paths to ICC jurisdiction. The first would be referral by the UN Security Council under Article 13b, and the second would be an ad hoc acceptance of the ICC's jurisdiction for this specific situation by either Ethiopia or Eritrea under Article 12.3 of the Rome Statute. Those are obviously politically contingent and indeed potentially politically impossible paths at this moment. But crucially, both can apply retroactively. And that means that they remain a possibility into the future, including as political conditions change. And there are no statutes of limitations in this respect. So that possibility remains in the background, not particularly likely in this moment, but always possible in the future. The second alternative would be the creation of an ad hoc internationalized tribunal. That would ordinarily be through the agreement of an affected state with an international organization, such as the African Union or the United Nations. That would typically occur in a peace process or potentially after a regime transition, and can occur with the agreement of a third state that's not directly implicated in the conflict. For example, if it's hosting or has on its territory key perpetrators of some of the crimes, and it might then engage in an agreement with an international organization. This is also obviously politically contingent and difficult, but again, it can apply retroactively too, as long as the acts in question were international crimes at the time of their commission. And so that too remains in the background as a possibility, including as political conditions change in the future. The third alternative is universal jurisdiction. It's now widely accepted in international law that domestic courts, as long as there's domestic legislation to support them, can exercise jurisdiction over crimes against humanity, war crimes, or genocide, regardless of where those crimes were perpetrated and regardless of the nationality of the victims or perpetrators. That indeed is the primary avenue for accountability for war crimes in Syria at this moment. And it can be augmented at the international level through the creation of an international mechanism such as the IIIM for Syria by the UN General Assembly in that case, or by the UN Human Rights Council or another agency seeking to establish this kind of mechanism, which would then collect, organize, and preserve evidence of specific crimes for specific cases that can then be transferred to the appropriate jurisdictions when cases become viable. So those are the jurisdictional pathways. The second question is, which crimes? The situation in Tigray at the moment is, in legal terms, a non-international armed conflict. That could change, but that seems very likely to be the situation on the ground at this moment based on what we know. The implications of that are that non-international armed conflict war crimes law applies, and in addition, crimes against humanity can apply. They require no nexus to an armed conflict, instead requiring a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population pursuant to a state or organizational policy. Within the war crimes category in non-international armed conflicts, a number of crimes have been implicated in this report: pillage, unnecessary destruction of adversaries' property or seizure of that property, rape and sexual violence, attacks on civilians, attacks on humanitarian workers, attacks on hospitals, and the like. And crimes against humanity are also implicated in this report, including murder, extermination, a form of mass killing that can occur can include the deprivation of food or medicine, forcible transfer, rape and sexual violence as a crime against humanity, and other inhumane acts. But perhaps most centrally implicated in this report is the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare, which is codified for non-international armed conflicts in Article 8.2e19 in the Rome Statute and in a number of universal jurisdiction statutes in various states. That crime attaches when a perpetrator, in a context associated with an armed conflict, deprives civilians of objects indispensable to their survival with the intent to use starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. Crucially, it can attach regardless of the consequence of that deprivation. In other words, the prosecutor doesn't have to show that civilians starved as a result of that deprivation. She just needs to show the deprivation combined with the intent. That also means she doesn't need to exclude other causes of starvation when starvation does arise. Additionally, the deprivation can take any number of forms, and you heard many of them referenced in this report. It needn't be the case that the objects indispensable to survival are destroyed or removed or rendered useless or attacked. It can also be the case that objects indispensable to survival are that civilians are deprived of those objects through the denial of humanitarian access or through the denial of coping strategies that are essential to accessing those indispensable objects. The key challenge with this crime, though, is establishing intent. And there's both a legal debate as to exactly what the threshold for intent is, whether the perpetrator has to have the purpose of starving civilians, or whether it's sufficient that they know with a virtual certainty that civilians will be starved. And then there's the evidentiary challenge of meeting either one of those thresholds. Notwithstanding that, this report provides prima facie evidence of this starvation crime on either one of those thresholds, including the higher purposive intent threshold. And so there's at least the basis for deeper criminal investigation. The bottom line is this legal apparatus exists and it will endure. And the consequence of that is that even if political conditions at this moment make accountability difficult, these legal resources will be there when those political conditions change. And as I mentioned, there's no statute of limitations on international crimes. So that's how I think about jurisdiction and the applicable crimes in this situation.
Let me pose a question back to you, Tom, to start off with, which is actually picking up on a point that was made by Mimi in the Q&A, which is really a reparations question. So you have talked about prosecution. Prosecution, of course, is not the only legal option. Is there an opening here for those who are responsible for destruction or pillage to be required to compensate, restitute, or pay reparations in some way?
Yeah, I mean, that can occur, for one thing, through the International Criminal Court process. So if you have a prosecution, the International Criminal Court introduced atypically from international tribunals up to that point, a reparations procedure that is attached to the end of a criminal prosecution. So if there's a conviction, there's then the basis for issuing reparations under Article 75 of the Rome Statute, and there's a trust fund for victims, which can also facilitate the provision of those resources, even in the case of an indigent perpetrator. There's also the possibility of a reparations scheme being set up separately on an ad hoc basis. For example, following the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea at the turn of the millennium, there was a series of arbitration awards which included reparations awards, although the question of then enforcing the payment of those reparations is a more complicated one. And finally, you could in principle have reparations claims before a human rights court, which could then issue reparations orders, which could be applicable in this context. Human rights law continues to apply in the context of armed conflict. And so there are various ways in which that could happen. It's very difficult to enforce them. And as I mentioned, they could be attached to criminal prosecutions at the International Criminal Court.
Thank you. Let me just make a general point, and then I'm going to direct one or two more questions, which is for those of you who are interested in justice post-conflict, there is an wholly unexplored agenda here of transitional justice for starvation crimes, which would, in my view, begin with acknowledging the crime and telling the truth. Because one of the tragic realities for those who've survived famine is that their experience of it, their memory of it, is of their own personal failure, the failure of parents to feed their children, the failure of mothers to be able to take their children and get essential care. And so they blame themselves. And I think acknowledging the crime and a process of truth-telling is a way of lifting that burden of indignity and shame and allowing people who are the victims of this peculiarly cruel infliction to be able to say, it wasn't our fault, it was inflicted on us. And I think that our first duty in responding to a crime of this magnitude, our first duty is to those who are the victims and the survivors, in order to make them understand that they are not alone. It is not their fault. They should not feel ashamed for what they have undergone. So that is just a general point. Now, there are a number of questions that have been posed in the chat. And Michael Sasson has posed the question following the title of a book by David Keane, The Benefits of Famine. Who is benefiting from this starvation and in what ways? And I want to throw this over to the three research assistants who have worked on this and ask if any of them wants to indicate from the research and where they see the benefits being accrued, who is actually gaining from this, if anybody.
Sure, I'm happy to take the first stab at that. I mean, I think that question is implicit in why we chose to put so much emphasis in the report on seasonal labor migration and the sesame industry nationally and within Tigray. There are many aspects, of course, of the Tigrayan economy and the livelihood systems of the region that we could have focused on, but I think while it's not to say that the primary motivations are economic and that this is a war over sesame, please don't get me wrong on that. I think it can't be also, on the other hand, we can't exclude it entirely that were this ethnic cleansing attempt to be successful, were this massive annexation of land from one region of Ethiopia to another to go through, it would in effect be one of the largest single transfers of wealth in the country's history, outside of the nationalization of all land a few decades ago. We are talking about a few $100 million, depending on the global price of sesame year to year, as well as hundreds of thousands, again, of some of the highest paying jobs in terms of seasonal labor jobs, not all jobs, in the country. I mean, this is what would be forcibly transferred. Not only is that the benefit to the recipients and how they allocate that transfer of wealth and those opportunities, but also would hobble the Tigrayan economy for decades. You know, the sort of rump Tigray that would be left behind, having had its sesame producing regions sort of excised from it, would be wholly incapable of supporting itself, of achieving food security in any sustainable fashion as it currently exists.
Apologies, I was having difficulty unmuting. Thank you, Chris. Do any of the others want to come in? And maybe Hadush, there's a cluster of questions around what the purported motivation is for this this particular kind of war. And maybe, do you want to address that question?
Thank you, Alex. I would say I can see two things basically. One, from the Ethiopian government side, is only motivated in terms of it's politically motivated. The federal government wants us to control everything. I mean, there is a long way of, as we know, the long way struggle of the TPLF before 30 years was like to have each states have their own constitutional law and their rule of law, and then to govern themselves as independent and other federal states. But there is a new motive at this time where the federal government wants to turn that to a unitary system where it had been there for a long period of time. So, I mean, there is an interest in a political motive of the federal government where it wants to a unified system of governance to establish it on the country. And the other way, there is also another interest coming from the Eritrean side that would be, it's a kind of, I would say it's a revenge, basically. I mean, the Eritrean government was not playing its own role in the international, for the last, let's say 20 years, Eritrea has been neglected from the international community, and they were not doing much. And they believe, they just think that this was the result of the government which has been there in Ethiopia for the last 20 years. So they just want to revenge. I mean, basically, the power which was just leading in Ethiopia for the last 20 years was the APRDF was in power, and we know that that power was just correlated to the Tigrayan, basically. So they say they just are playing their role to revenge what they thought they just lost with the last 20 years. That's how I see. I mean, a revenge and a political motive to a unitary system just both comes at a point, and they just want to dismantle the forces that stands against them.
Thank you, Hadush. Of course, the political complexities of this crisis are really outside the capacity of us to delve into detail here. I would just really say, add 2 points to that. The first is, of course, the war broke out on November the 3rd, but no war breaks out overnight. There are always other reasons for war. And the second, which is really the core point behind our discussion today, is that irrespective of how the war broke out, irrespective of the justification that there may or may not have been for armed conflict, we are talking about crimes committed during armed conflict. And those are crimes that cannot be justified, whatever the justification there may be for going to war. And as Dean Kite mentioned, I'm a figure of some controversy in this in these discussions. And I always tell the Ethiopians who disagree with me, we are entitled to disagree on any number of political issues. You can have your opinion, I can have mine. But let us be honest to the facts. And in that, be aware that when a woman who has suffered rape comes forward with these extraordinarily cruel, intimate stories, are you really saying that she's making it up? I don't believe you can genuinely be saying that. And also be aware that I also have my private conversations with people in quite senior positions in the government of Ethiopia, and they admit to me, yes, it is like this. And if you follow the statements of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, he said one thing, in November, the war is over, not a single civilian has been killed. He's no longer saying that. He said in November and December and January, the Eritreans are not here. He's no longer saying that. Those of you who want to challenge the facts, please be careful before you align yourself with somebody who is changing what he says is the reality. Let me move on to one or two other questions that are arising, and I'm going to pose one to Tom, which is the tricky one, the genocide question, which is a question that might be best ducked, but I'm going to throw it out to you.
Yeah, I mean, so this report doesn't focus on the key evidentiary thresholds that would need to be established to show genocide. The difficulty with showing genocide here is not necessarily the underlying acts, whether that's the infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group, or killing, or indeed rape. But the difficulty with genocide is establishing the special intent. Genocide requires the specific intent to destroy a racial, religious, ethnic, or national group in whole or in part. And establishing that intent is always the key stumbling block in establishing genocide in any particular case. And so you can have contexts where the crime against humanity of extermination is straightforwardly established, and this has occurred in multiple cases before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and yet you can't get over the genocide threshold because of the difficulty of establishing that special intent. And this report doesn't detail any facts relating to that special intent, or at least that's not the core focus of the report. And so without specific evidence on that, I wouldn't want to take a position one way or another on it, but it's certainly possible. And as I said, that would be the question. The question is, can you show that specific intent to destroy this kind of group in whole or in part? And that's an extremely difficult and often frustrating threshold in international criminal law.
Let me add one other point to that, which is, I think there is a misapprehension among many who are campaigning using the term genocide, that if it were to be declared a genocide, there would be an obligation to intervene. Now, we discovered during the conflict in Darfur in Sudan some 15 years ago that there was a very powerful mass mobilization campaign in order to declare Darfur a genocide, on the assumption this would force the US to intervene. And the US Secretary of State commissioned, two things happened. First, the US Secretary of State commissioned a report which said, yes, acts of genocide had been committed. He accepted the report, he said it's true, and then he said, this does not change our policy. And the matter then went to a special investigation headed by a very senior judge, Antonio Cassese, who determined that he wasn't sure whether genocide had been committed. He was clear that massive crimes had been committed, but he wasn't clear if it was genocide, on precisely the grounds that Professor Danandane explained. And what that meant was that the government of Sudan and its supporters said, oh, we are innocent. We didn't commit genocide. Well, they had committed all sorts of crimes. Just because it's not proven that you have committed genocide doesn't make you innocent. So I think the genocide question actually is a bit of a distraction from the core question. That would be my personal take on that particular issue. There are a number of political issues that have been raised in the Q&A, which really go beyond the scope of this report. I just want to mention, just focus on the UN Security Council and what has happened and what might yet happen. The case of Tigray was raised in the UN Security Council by Ireland using UN Security Council Resolution 2417. That was a resolution on armed conflict and hunger that was passed in May of 2018, almost 3 years ago, which puts an obligation on the UN Secretary General to report to Council if armed conflict may be threatening food insecurity. And it also, and it creates a sort of an accountability mechanism within the UN Security Council that they have to do something about it. It also, it does not introduce any new law, but it emphasizes that starvation of war, starvation of civilians in times of war may be a war crime. Now, that was brought to the UN Security Council in early March. It didn't go anywhere. There was a threat of veto, and the issue has been put on hold. It's likely to come back to the UN Security Council. I think after the briefing by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock, last week, it will be very difficult for the Security Council not to discuss this. And the issue of sexual and gender-based violence also is pushing this up the agenda of council members. There is as most of you will know, there's a resolution 1325 that is also very apposite in this situation. Do any of the members of our panel want to comment on any of this, including Dean Kite? Do you have a point that you would like to pitch in at this point?
No, sorry, actually, dealing with some media inquiries related exactly to this issue while we were talking. I think what's been I suppose shocking would be, I mean, that would be a personal word, but not really when we think about the struggles that the Security Council has experienced in recent times in terms of being able to come forward forcibly with a collective view in real time. I think there is some real reflection. We saw this in the comments of Ms. Patton as the Special Rapporteur. And then we've seen this in some of the mobilizing in the sexual slavery movement and elsewhere, is with such recent mobilization and deep support and sort of real processes of education around what Security Council Resolution 1325 means, how it can be made to sort of be more than words on the paper, and how it can actually live, and how it can inform strategies, both from the humanitarian response, but also from the world of peace building, peacekeeping, and then also in development terms. That, you know, with its extraordinary mobilization around getting 1325 agreed, and then having the world understand what 1325 means, that as the news has started to filter out of Tigray, and the scale of the atrocities and the scale of what would appear to be the systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of suppression or oppression, that there's been really quite a pronounced, if not silence, then quiet. And I think that in recent days I've started to see a lot of questioning going on amongst Security Council members. I think the Nordic permanent representatives and countries have been coordinated. This became an issue at the EU Foreign Ministers meeting yesterday. I know certainly the Swedish Foreign Minister and others have pushed this quite hard. And I say this understanding fully my own heritage and my nationality and the limits of my view, but I think that there are other parts of the world where you would expect people to speak out for the rights and the dignity of women and girls. You know, when one systematically abuses 8-year-old girls, you are defining a generation, and thereby defining a pathway to peace. And I think that this is something that the international community has grappled with in the last 20 to 30 years in particular, and it would be it will be obviously of interest from an international affairs perspective how we muddle our way through this particular situation. But from a human perspective, the responsibility to protect the notions of human rights as we understand them now, these Security Council resolutions that have been put in place after extraordinary efforts and lobbying globally to do so, one would hope that they are more than words on the page and that they can be used somehow to protect girls in real time.
Thank you very much. I mean, that is why we're all here, why we are also, I think, motivated to join the Fletcher community, because not just because we are interested in studying these things from intellectual curiosity, but from moral concern as well. In the last few minutes, I want to give each of our panelists just a minute to reflect on in turn, and I'll go, and Chris Newton, you'll go first, just to give you the heads up. No, sorry, Hadush, you should go first, because we'll go in order. Just on any of the questions that have been raised, or any of the points that have been raised in the discussion. So Hadush, thank you for joining us. I know this is obviously both distressing and important to you. We're having difficulty hearing you, Hadush. Like, you are still muted. Okay, there we are.
Which question should I address? I mean, do I need to pick one?
You can pick one, or you can make a general comment as you wish.
Just I mean, let me take and then let me just take the general comment. Basically, what I see is really cruel and inhuman thing is happening in Tigray. I think when we see it from here, when we see people are dying starvation, and when they are systematically put in a place where they can sustain their life, and when I would think about the future of them, for example, those particular farmers who are not able to plow their land next year, and then, I mean, even there is no way that they could be sure they get a kind of aid or from the international community. That would be a stressful condition. I urge the international community, I urge the government, I mean, world leaders basically to think about that, to bring a solution to this atrocity where really a very human being are just suffering beyond their curiosity.
Thank you, Hadush, and once again we extend our sympathies and condolences to you and your family and everyone who you know who is undergoing this unspeakable suffering. Chris Newton.
Thank you, Alex. I think maybe I'll leave off on two quick points. The one being, there's no need to wait, whether it's for humanitarian action or pursuing accountability for starvation crimes, until something like famine is declared, or we all agree that famine is ongoing, right? As Professor Dannenbaum highlighted, there's absolutely no need on the legal side for famine to have occurred to be pursuing legal accountability for starvation crimes. That is not a threshold that we need to hit. But even on the humanitarian side and broadly for the international community, there is a entrenched hesitancy for action, whether it's political pressure or it's pushing hard as humanitarians, to wait until a famine has been declared. And certainly in Tigray, with the level of suppression of information that we see, that is almost certainly not going to happen, no matter how bad things get, no matter how apparent it may be in other ways. The systems that have been built up for declaring a famine in the humanitarian sector are unlikely to get there. But there's still so much that we can do, from, again, humanitarian action to accountability, without ever reaching that point. And certainly a very high level, or there can be a very high level of loss of life, very high level of death that occurs up to famine, near famine, than famine itself. And it's important to keep that in mind. And then lastly, just back to that one of the first questions that was asked in terms of who is benefiting from this. Our report, rightfully so, focuses mostly on what is being done in Tigray and who is being targeted and what is being targeted. But it certainly is always good to keep in mind who is benefiting at a variety of levels, whether we're talking about that sesame production or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Brew.
Thank you, Professor. I guess I'll close with some thoughts on really, the United States foreign policy in Ethiopia. And I certainly share the disappointment in what it seemed as limited reaction to what we've seen in our report. At the same time, we've seen fairly effective diplomatic negotiations with Senator Coons, who is able to kind of push Abiy to finally admit the presence of Eritrean troops. So all that being said, this is clearly an opportunity, I would say, for President Biden to really make his mark on foreign policy in the Horn, and he would be absolutely remiss to miss this opportunity. So I think it's absolutely imperative that the pressure is maintained and that the discussion goes on.
Chris, you speak on the first day of the Jeff Feltman, the special envoy for the Horn, being in office. So let's see what he has to say. Delia.
Yeah, I guess I will just close with 2 points. One, pursuant to the earlier point about, what famine is used for and what starvation crimes are used for. I think it's important to remember a historical perspective in this region, and that is the repeated taking of lands and dispute over land and different groups feeling to some extent on all sides that they've been robbed of something that they were entitled to by their identity or the history of their people. So I think that storyline that goes back decades of these border disputes that go back decades and even centuries in some cases will require a much deeper reconciliation process, and one that we're seeing starvation crimes very obviously play out that very same narrative that we've seen drive insecurity in this region before. And the second point is on the sexual violence. It's becoming even more and more clear that it is absolutely systematic and being used as a way to render especially women and girls completely immobilized. We've seen the cases that have been getting treated are incredibly severe. It is likely that the vast majority, and what is likely to be in the tens of thousands, are going untreated, and we'll definitely see that an entire generation is affected by this very severe collective trauma and humiliation. And so that is something that we definitely should continue to watch as well.
Thank you. And there was a point in the Q&A about the importance of acknowledging this, acknowledging to those women that, yes, we believe you, and it wasn't your fault. Tom.
Yeah, let me just address a couple of things very quickly. One is a question that was raised in the chat about international and non-international armed conflicts. I addressed that in the Q&A in the text for anybody who's interested in that specific issue and why this is a non-international armed conflict. But on a couple of issues that have been raised in the discussion, first on the Security Council, regardless of what the Security Council does in response to this situation, when we're thinking about Security Council referral to the International Criminal Court in particular under 13b, there's a couple of things to bear in mind. So the Security Council has referred situations to the ICC in the past, Darfur and Libya in 2005 and 2011 respectively, but there are several key factors that have changed since then. First of all, the United States and Russia have actors that are under active investigation by the International Criminal Court. United States in the situation that comprises Afghanistan, Poland, Lithuania, and Romania, the context of torture. Russia in the context of Georgia, and then also potentially in the context of Ukraine. And then, of course, the United States is extremely interested in the open investigation in the Palestinian territories and the implications of that for Israeli actors, particularly on the issue of settlements. And so those conditions mean that those two states, Russia and the United States, have a very different posture vis-a-vis the International Criminal Court than they had in 2005 and 2011. And that makes a referral to the ICC, even when the Security Council is willing to act on other dimensions, more unlikely than it has been in the past. The second issue is somebody raised a question regarding the possibility of a state being held responsible for the wrongful acts of another state on its territory. In this case, is there a way to hold Ethiopia responsible for the wrongful acts of Eritrean troops on Ethiopian territory? There clearly is under human rights law. A state has human rights law obligations to all in its territory, regardless of the actor that's perpetrating the violations against them. We've actually seen states such as Macedonia and Poland be held responsible for US torture on their territory. And so there's precedent for that. That was one of the questions in the chat under human rights law. It's also possible under international humanitarian law due to the duty of states to ensure respect and not just directly respect themselves, international humanitarian law under Common Article 1. So that's also a possible possibly implicated rule here. And then there's additional to that, the article on state responsibility in Article 16 of the Articles on State Responsibility for Internationally Wrongful Acts, drafted by the International Law Commission in 2001, that specifically provides for state responsibility for aiding and assisting another state in a violation of international law. That would clearly include consenting to that state's activity on its territory in violation of obligations that would apply to the state that is granting that consent. And so Ethiopia could face state responsibility there. There's still, of course, on all of those, a question of jurisdiction. And as you will have gathered from the remarks I gave earlier, that's always a threshold question in international law and a complicated one when we're thinking about how to hold states to account. But there are those various legal tools that would be applicable here and that would generate responsibility legally for Ethiopia regarding the acts of Eritrean forces on its territory.
Thank you. I think that for some of us that will we will be calling on you to put that in writing, because you condensed a lot of complexity into just a few minutes. It remains for me to thank you all for coming and to thank our panelists, and to finally give the last word to our dean, who has provided the opportunity, and I'm also grateful for providing the resolve for defending academic freedom under some considerable fire.
Well, that's a very small role to play, but I want to thank you, Alex, and the team at the World Peace Foundation. To Professor Dannenbaum, thank you for your insights and your erudition and your commitment to really pushing back the boundaries of understanding, and to the Fletcher students and to the students who've worked on this. Kudos to you for your leadership, and to those of you who have been touched by this conflict, who are experiencing loss, who are deeply anxious about how this is going to move forward and resolve. You have my heartfelt empathy and condolences where that's appropriate. So one of the things that we're the proudest of at Fletcher is holding the space to debate, to deepen our understanding, to challenge each other, to follow the evidence, to be data informed, to look courageously into the grey areas between disciplines and into the murky areas of conflict and relationships between states and between peoples. We have to do that, and we have to use the broad shoulders that come with being an elite institution or a prestigious institution committed to justice and peace around the world. We have to use the shoulders that we have. We stand on many shoulders before us, but we have to use everything as the Fletcher School to keep hope in that space, so that we can be a source of information, a source of understanding, a source of scholarship and an insight that may, in the hands of those who hold power or those who agitate for change, that our work can actually bring about. that world of more justice and peace, which was so important to our founding. So with all of that, I want to thank you. Thank you for, we had an extraordinary attendance. I hope that all of you can go away feeling that you have been challenged, or that you have greater understanding, that you will follow this story, and that you will get involved and ask for the international community to fulfill its obligations to protect everyone, and in this case in particular to protect the children and the civilians of this troubled part of the world. Thank you very much indeed.